G'day and welcome to the Fred Paul Show. People who can't help but notice that liberal democracies like Australia are engaged in an orgy of self-loathing and despotism that can only end in pointless national suicide are often also heartened by the fact that there are still places in the world where freedom and prosperity are valued and the principles that enable them are still respected. Perhaps the one nation where this is more so than all others is Hungary, a nation of only 9.6 million people occupying land less than half the size of Victoria. It has become something of a pilgrimage for conservative thinkers and writers. Part of the attraction is a think tank called the Danube Institute, whose executive director, Istvan, I will speak to in a minute. My colleague, Nick Cater, will be spending 3 months at the Danube Institute as a visiting fellow later this year. He is one of many Australians who have discovered that Hungary harbours a love of freedom, family and free speech, the sort of things that once made Australia such a thriving and independent country. This month it will host another CPAC Conservative conference, the third in 3 years, and it has been visited by such commentators as our former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, Tucker Carlson and Josh Hammer from the United States. Well, I was lucky enough to visit there myself in a less formal capacity, more like a tourist, in December, and I found the place to be both remarkably friendly, clean and peaceful, but also still haunted by the recent and very troubling past. Hungary was at the start of World War II an ally of the Nazis, then later in the war was ruled by the notoriously cruel Arrow Cross Party, who tortured and murdered thousands of Hungarians, many of them on little more than suspicion of descent. There is a museum of this in Budapest, which is one of the most horrifying and dark places I've ever visited. I recommend it if you do go there, but be warned, it's not a pleasant place. The country was then occupied by the Soviets, who rather than offering a relief from the Arrow Cross's barbaric rule, just simply continued it. There was a moment in 1956 when a popular uprising looked for a few days like it would force the Soviets to withdraw, but they didn't. Instead, they doubled down their oppressive rule until they finally left in 1991. Even to a tourist, Budapest still exudes a strong memory of a cruel past amid the wonderful renovation that has gone on since the Russians left. Its boulevards of grand buildings, the magnificent St Stephen's Basilica, its charming trams, the Houses of Parliament, which were modelled on the original Parliament in Westminster, London, the art galleries, the bridges over the Danube, the elaborately housed hot baths, and the Buda Castle, as well as the markets and more pedestrian attractions, combine to make Budapest, I got to say this, a bit like Paris, but with far fewer tourists. A visit will restore your faith in European culture and tradition, even as Western Europe is being destroyed by an invasion of violent and hostile so-called refugees. Well, let's bring in Danube Institute Executive Director Istvan to elaborate on how Hungary became such a beacon of freedom in Central Europe. Istvan, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Fred, and also thank you for a very nice introduction to Hungary.
Oh, well, thank you for the pleasant time I spent there briefly in December. Now, having spent only a short time in your country, Istvan, I can only say, and it's based on the superficial observations of a tourist, that Hungary's phenomenal passion for freedom and prosperity are mostly a hangover of the cruelty and oppression that the nation has endured since World War II. But is there more to it than that?
I believe that plays a very important role. So Hungary has suffered a lot. Unlike some parts of Western Europe or most of the Anglosphere, Hungary has been occupied in most of the past 500 years, basically. So kind of our fight for freedom has been embedded in the Hungarian culture. And what you will see as kind of a freedom of speech and also of freedom of ideas, I think, is coming that we only quite recently regained our independence. So after the fall of communism, it's still a new thing for us to be free, and we wouldn't like to sacrifice that freedom quite easily. And, you know, if we think about some of the vogue things which are happening in some parts of Western Europe or the Western world, Hungary, we like to think in Hungary that we are kind of partly vaccinated against it. Because of communism. So we saw some of these policies being implemented by the state during communism, and we kind of recognize the dangers when we see them happening in the United States or the United Kingdom, or sadly perhaps sometimes even here in Australia as well. Hopefully it's kind of a long-term vaccination like the polio and not a short-term one like the COVID vaccination. But I think it does give us some form of resistance towards these ideas. And I think it's crucial, but also I think our kind of conservative movement have learned during that occupation period on how to stick together, how to preserve conservative values. And we have been fighting to preserve them ever since.
Well, so, can I interrupt you there? Because there's one very shining example of that, and that is the tax structure in Hungary, which absolutely positively encourages people to get married and have families, not just small families, but quite large ones. Can you explain to the viewers how that works?
Yes, I will try, but it's a very complex program, so I will not have time to go into every detail of it. But I think the kind of underlining theory behind it is what is interesting, because we kind of rejected the notion that you cannot do anything about your demography. So I think a lot of Western European countries think that demographies are low, birth rates are low, we cannot really do anything about it, so we need migration. We said that's not right. Actually, people want to have more kids, but because of economic reasons mostly, I think there are cultural reasons as well, but we can talk about that a bit more. But there's a very big economic element why people will not you will not have more kids. If you look at a lot of statistics, even places like very progressive places like Sweden, actually women want to have more kids than what they currently have. And if you ask them why don't they have them, it's because of economic reasons. And I think the Hungarian system understood that. And also I think it's unique in the sense that we didn't want to have people on welfare or people not working having more kids, having 5, 6 kids just because of welfare. So we basically installed a system where you are supporting families who are working with tax credits, with kind of low interest loans, and also sometimes with low interest loans which basically turn into free money if you have 3 kids or more. I think also a very important element is this kind of low interest loan and kind of free, which turns into free money after a while if you have 3 kids or more, is a very important element, because that you can only use, part of it you can only use to buy new homes or build new homes. And I think that helps young couples who are struggling to have homes. And of course, when you have homes, you're more ready to have more kids as well. I think that's something which all across the Western world people have been struggling with. You have a housing crisis, and I think that's partly true for Hungary as well. But these government policies has allowed people to buy properties, to build properties, and have kids as well. It's kind of a marriage of 2 good things. I myself have benefited from these programs. I don't think I would have been able to build a house in the countryside without these policies. And I see it in my neighborhood. So there's more and more young people turning up. When I bought that plot of land, there was only 2 houses. Now there's 6. And all of them are full of kids and, newly married parents. So,
Istvan, it sounds like the Australia I grew up in. I grew up in, as most of my viewers did, in neighbourhoods of new houses, all occupied by families with at least 3 children in them, and all the kids played together, and all the adults became friends. Now, that is the sort of culture and society that built Australia, and it's obviously being officially recognised in Hungary that this is an important phenomenon to encourage, to ensure that the country and its culture and its prosperity continue. Now, I'd argue that in Australia, that has slipped from the view of the people who are ruling us. But can you just elaborate on how important or how much the government recognises the importance of strong families to maintain a strong culture?
Well, I think there's a very telling number that the Hungarian government now spends about 5% of its GDP on the family protection programs. That's a huge amount of money, and it's the highest in the OECD by far.
Can you just elaborate what the family protection programs are? What are they?
As I said, there's several elements. There's tax breaks. For example, one thing which I think is very unique is that, for example, women who have 4 or more kids don't have to pay personal income tax for their life.
Right.
Which is actually now being extended to mothers who have 3 kids.
Right. And that's on the condition that she stays married to the father, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, but also a lot of these programs are aimed at encouraging people to get married. So most of these benefits, I mean, some of them you can get even if you have the kids, but some of them you can only get if you are actually married. And it's important that it's actually being married and not being in a civil partnership or a civil union. It has to be marriage. And it seems to be working because actually marriage rates doubled and divorce rates went down by almost half. So yes, I think that kind of very crucial element that being married is part of these programs is very important because we can see that it's people are happier who are married, and also the kids who are growing up in married households are also happier and doing much better in schools. But perhaps going back to the policies, as I said, we have several other policies as well. This kind of home building loan, I think, is very important because, I mean, in Hungary, for example, you can get about $100,000 from the government on low-interest loan, which is maximum 3%. And some of that, actually about half of that, you don't have to pay back if you have more than 3 kids. And this is being expanded now because, sadly, property prices went up. It's partly because of this program, but also because of COVID, because of the war in Ukraine and high inflation, high energy prices. So they're actually extending this program, and people will be getting around $150,000 as low-interest loans. Part of it can transform into free money if they buy new houses or build new houses. There's separate programs which are focusing on the countryside. So there's loans you can only pick up if you're living in villages which have a population under 5,000 people and have a decreasing population. So we were trying to kind of help people to stay in villages or young people to move into villages and be kind of part of nature and also don't allow these rural settlements to disappear. There was also a program where you could get, again, government support to buy bigger cars around.
We've got a government trying to shove us into battery-powered cars that nobody wants. I mean, Australia has always loved big cars because we're a big country. We often have to drive long distances, but at the moment, we have a government that is obsessed with giving us electric cars, which none of us want. Now, just getting back to, you mentioned 5% of GDP is spent on these family-oriented policies. Here's a figure for you. 9% of our government's GDP is spent on welfare. I mean, that is mostly money that isn't very productive. It's keeping people off the streets, perhaps, but it's not a lot of the time, it's not encouraging them to actually get work and pay taxes themselves. What's the welfare situation like in Hungary?
Well, of course, we inherited a pretty big welfare state from communism. But I think our conservative government has, again, kind of uniquely started a program where they are encouraging people to work instead of being on welfare. We like to call it kind of a workfare society, which might sound a bit bad in the Anglosphere, but we actually cut down social welfare. So if you want to stay at home and don't work, then you will get some social welfare, but it's very low. It's around $100, so perhaps a bit more, but around that figure. So even in Hungary, that's something which is not very much. But we promised these people work. And we started with workfare programs, which I honestly initially was a bit skeptical about because I have some libertarian leanings in economics. And you know, these were kind of jobs in local municipalities, kind of local sports clubs. They were sometimes cutting down the grass there, or you know, building pavements. But it seems to be working. So if you look at the statistics, more than 300,000 people were involved in these programs when they started them. Now there's less than 100,000 people involved. We have record low unemployment levels. And we also have a lot of these people going, as I said, going back to the proper labor market. Also, there's some, you know, success stories. So I did some research on this when I was working for another think tank in Hungary. And you have, you know, kind of small communities where these people actually did farms, made kind of small clothes factories, which are doing stuff for IKEA and other multinational companies. And, you know, they get kind of something like the minimum wage level, so it's not very good to pay, but it's still much better than if you're staying on welfare. But I think the kind of the inherent idea, which is important, that you cannot stay home on welfare, you have to work. And that's, I think, helps kind of the future generations as well, because you will have kids growing up seeing their parents go to work.
Well, that's right. And also you're engendering a community-wide work ethic where it is accepted that everyone needs to work. Now, can I segue?
But also just a quick interruption here, that when we interviewed these people feel better as well, because now when they, you know, after a hard day's work go into the pub or just go home, they feel better about themselves. People will, you know, say that, oh, I saw you working. You're actually doing something, not just staying at home and not doing anything.
Yeah, sadly, the welfare culture in Australia actually allows people, you know, gives people credence or legitimacy to actually sit at home and not do much at all. But this is not unrelated to immigration, I'd argue. This is potentially a touchy subject, but how does this relate to immigration in Hungary? I mean, we have a fairly non-discriminatory immigration policy, much to our regret, I'd argue. What is Hungary more selective about the people it allows to settle in the country?
Well, actually, interestingly, I mean, I think our migration laws are not necessarily very strict, or not unlike other European countries. What is different is that we said a very hard no to illegal migration. So if you're trying to get into Hungary and you're not a proper refugee, you don't have reasons to seek asylum, then you will not be allowed into Hungary. Also, we don't have, you know, very big schemes to get in students or other people on work visas. But we do allow, I mean, we do have people coming in on work visas. We have industries where we need people, and if they are coming in legally and we are vetting them, then that's fine. So we do have, you know, people coming in from Asia time to time on work visas. But
one of the conditions is they have to learn Hungarian as well, isn't it? Is that right?
Yes, but also they, you know, we are selecting them for specific jobs. So we know that, let's say, we need 1,000 bus drivers in Budapest because we don't have enough. We try to, you know, get the Hungarians doing that as well in the meantime. But until we can have that, we would, let's say, invite in people from Mongolia or Vietnam to do it. But they have fixed contracts, so they will do it. And then, you know, if the contract expires, they will go home. Also, we do not allow them to bring the family or do family unifications. But I think what is the most important element here is that we said a very hard no to illegal migration. So during the 2015 migration crisis, we had about 1 million people coming to the Hungarian border. And these people were burning their passports. They were all claiming to be Syrians, but they were not. Most of them were actually people from the Balkans, people from Kosovo, Albania, who were trying to go to Europe and work there. And, you know, I mean, having borders and you know, just migrating for economic reason is not a right.
Yeah, protecting a border is one of the fundamental jobs of a national government. Now, Istvan, can I just segue into something that I observed while I was there? It's a fantastic, innovative idea that would never get up in Australia. It's a thing called a ruin bar. You might be familiar with it. It is a shot of me in one in Budapest. These are bars that are essentially in, as far as I know, in a condemned sort of industrial-style warehouse or a building in the middle of the city, and bar managers are allowed to occupy them while the owner decides what eventually will happen with the building in the long run. I got to say, doing something like this in Australia would be absolutely unthinkable. The number of government departments you have to go to just to build a new bar, let alone one in a condemned building, is prohibitive. Now, is this kind of thinking natural to Hungarians, or is this the result of Hungary just in a rebuilding phase after the departure of the Soviets?
Well, that's a pretty interesting question. I think we Hungarians like to think of ourselves as kind of entrepreneur people who try to, I mean, in a good sense, but also who try to find loopholes and also make things work for them. So I think it is part of Hungarian culture to some extent that if we want to very hard to survive. And if that's, you know, doing bars in sketchy places, then we will do bars in sketchy places. But I mean, this has been part of my history, sadly. So we had 500 years of prosperity, very nice things as the Hungarian kingdom. And then afterwards, sadly, 500 years of occupation from the Ottomans, the Austrians and the Russians. And we're kind of, that made us people who try to find survival in even one of the hardest circumstances as well.
Well, Australia was born in similar circumstances, but I've got to say, Istvan, we've certainly lost that entrepreneurial spirit, I think. I mean, we began as a penal colony, so, you know, top that, Hungary. Anyway, another thing you don't often associate with Hungary is, to be honest, is humour. I mean, you know, Central Europeans, to us Australians, don't come across as predominantly funny people. But here's something I stumbled across in District 6 in Budapest, which is the sort of late-night entertainment area. This is a sign that depicts a comical illustration of someone urinating on the street, and the sign warns that anybody doing so will wind up on YouTube. Now, again, Istvan, Australians like to think of themselves as pretty funny people, but our government would never be that funny or flippant. Is this typical of Hungarian humour?
I think so, but I'm also not sure if you rode some public transport, because on the metros and some of the trams you have similar kind of funny signs about, you know, don't have your hat on or don't eat at the public spaces. So actually that's kind of a funny campaign I think the city of Budapest started. I think it's actually very strange because I think Hungarian humour is very much related to British humour, which I guess is related to Australian humour as well. There's some series which surprisingly were only very popular in the UK and of course some other places, well, and in Hungary, like Rang My Lord or Blackadder. So I think, I'm not sure why this is, but for some reason we have kind of this dark, witty humour, which is, I think, very, very closely related to British humour.
Well, there you go, viewers. There's another reason to want to visit Hungary, and I recommend it highly. Budapest is one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I've got to thank Istvan Kiss from the Danube Institute for coming on to talk about it. Thanks, Istvan.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's Istvan Kiss of the Danube Institute in Budapest, one of the great cities of the world.